For a while, I've always struggled with why the 1948 elections had huge coattails for Truman. He gained 9 seats back in the Senate and 75 back in the House to flip both chambers, and we'll get into that, despite having a very narrow electoral college margin of victory. Looking at these 78 electoral votes, if two of these three states of Illinois, Ohio, and California go to Dewey, it's forced into the House of Representatives. If three of them go Dewey's way, he wins the election outright. So it came down to a tipping point state of less than 1%. However, there are factors in the election itself that made it so that Truman could have won by much more had his party not been split. As we can clearly see, the Democrats were split between the Democrats and the Dixiecrats, and the Dixiecrats carried 4 states. So, we have that. And in case you're wondering, for the 1948 congressional elections, in case you didn't believe me, yeah, Democrats gained 9 and they gained 75 in the House. With, of course, their House margin exceeding their popular vote margin. But there's actually another split in the Democratic Party with the Progressives and Henry Wallace. Now, he didn't win any electoral college votes, nor did he get a significant chunk of the popular vote. But you look at the popular vote, Thurman got 2.4. He also got 2.4, just that, Thurman wound up getting more votes in the Deep South. So he actually wound up carrying states. And this is what I mean and why it gets so significant. If you add these together, this election looks a lot like 1944. And we'll get into what 1944 entailed for the Democrats later on in this video. But as we can see, Republicans lost 5 states. They lost Colorado, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Wyoming. Now, they gained a bunch of states in the Northeast: Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania. They also gained Michigan and Oregon. So they did gain a lot of states. And the Dixiecrats took 4 states away, but this election is very, very different. And we'll get into that. This election is very, very different if we have, these parties merge. But first of all, and we'll see if this happens after we add in all these states, this election had a big bias for the Republican Party based on the Electoral College. As Truman won by 4.5%, the tipping point state was under 1%. As we can see here, you had a solid base of Democratic states that led to a ton of wasted votes. And you can still see here that you had, you had more solid states for the Democrats, and then you had all these competitive states. Whereas Republicans, the only state that they won by over 15 points was their 25-point win in Vermont. You didn't even have a lot of states that were over 5%. Many of the Republicans' wins were close and competitive, hence giving them the advantage. The next time we saw an advantage anywhere near significant was in 2020. And for those unaware, in 2020, Biden won the popular vote by 4.5%. But as you can see, the tipping point state was 0.6% to force it into the House and just 1.2% to give Trump the outright victory. As all these swing states wound up voting to the left of the nation, and a lot of that also came down to, again, Democrats won a lot of states by solid, reliable margins that led to a lot of wasted votes. And you didn't really have too many competitive states in this election, whereas Republicans had their base, but you had a lot more competitive states on their side as compared to other years. By the way, this electoral college bias doesn't always tend to favor the Republicans. but it sometimes does. It usually does, actually. But going back to 1948, obviously the Dixiecrats are in solid South states. As you can see, all 4 states would support Eisenhower, though not all by solid margins. And they all supported FDR comfortably in 1944. But in 48, they went and voted for the Dixiecrats. They would have voted Democrat if the Dixiecrats didn't exist. They were the Solid South, and it was still the 1940s, so the Solid South was very much in force. The only real exception to the Solid South was in 1928, when Al Smith's Catholicism caused them to lose 5 states that were former Confederate states: Hoover, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, as well as making Alabama close. In 24, every single Confederate state wound up voting for Davis despite a landslide for the Republicans, and in 1920, Tennessee was the sole state to be carried by the Republicans. So it was a solid South. It was 1948. If not for the Dixiecrats, these states would have voted Democrat, and they would have voted Democrat in a landslide as well. So, Louisiana, it turns into a blowout. It turns into like a 60-point win for Democrats. Mississippi would turn into like a 95-point win for Democrats. Alabama would still be a 61-point win for Democrats now. South Carolina, probably like a 96-point win for Democrats. I'm not saying it would have gone the same way, but they all would have been safe for Democrats had the Dixiecrats not existed. I mean, it's tough to tell, seeing as what happened in South Carolina in 1952 when they lost a lot of Democratic support because of civil rights. That's probably the whole reason why the Dixiecrat was founded, but for this video, we're going to assume that these votes would have went on. And I get that there was a fate to select in Tennessee. It doesn't really matter either way, because either way, now this puts Truman at 352 electoral votes to the 189 won by Dewey. And because these votes are all joining a safe South, then we can see the effects on what the tipping point state would be. Seeing as now, what you have to do is changes. Seeing as now you have 153 votes in a solid Democratic column, you still have 69 and 32. That's 254. So that's 254 electoral votes. So now, winning Illinois, which is the safest of all the tilt states, at 0.84% guarantees Truman the victory. And actually, wait. That could still mean Illinois at 0.84% is still a tipping point state. I just realized that. There's got to be no way. There's actually got to be no way. Let's look at Dewey. 1 plus 189 plus, assuming the shift 25 plus 28. Wow. Dewey actually wins if he manages to flip Illinois. So a 0.9% shift is still enough. So the Electoral College bias didn't go away as much as I thought. And you also have to understand that in this scenario, 2.4% of the popular vote gets added to Truman's total. So while Dewey is stagnant at 45.1%, then Truman's goes up to 52%. So he now wins the popular vote by 6.9%. If you shift the nation over 0.9%, Truman could have won the election at this point by 6% and still have lost in the Electoral College. Now, I did not foresee that coming. But, it doesn't really matter when you sort of factor in Henry Wallace's effect. 3 states, as I found out: Maryland, Michigan, and Dewey's own home state of New York, if the Wallace voters voted in line with the Democrats, then these 3 states would have flipped to the Democratic side as well. And why do I think Henry Wallace voters would have supported them? Well, look. Henry Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the United States from 1941 to 1945 under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had John Nance Gardner for his first 2 terms. He had Truman in his last and complete term. Wallace was in his 3rd term. He ran a third-party campaign against Truman. So I think if he didn't... run, those votes would have gone to Truman. And it would have tipped 3 states back into his column. You know. I actually want to look at Indiana. No, he didn't win enough in Indiana to overcome it. You had the Prohibition Party that actually had a support. That actually got more support, but I don't think that that is really a party that we should be analyzing. So we won't. Anyway, going back to the Henry Wallace thing. In New York, Dewey won by 1%. Henry Wallace got 8% of the vote in New York, so the state is likely comfortably Democratic. Even more Democratic than it was in 1940 and in 1944 if Wallace didn't run. In Maryland, 1.4% win for Dewey. Wallace gets 1.7% of the vote. So the state would have tilted Democratic. Michigan, 2% of the vote in favor of Henry Wallace, and a 1.7% win by Dewey. Obviously, we don't know exactly how things would have gone in Maryland and Michigan, so that involves an assumption. I'm pretty confident that Dewey would have lost New York if not for Democrats splitting the vote. The reason why I'm more confident on New York was because in the other 2 states, like, you would have needed almost all Wallace voters to support Truman, and obviously some of them may not have voted, or they may have supported Dewey instead. Whereas, put this in comparison to New York, you would have only needed slightly more than 50% of the Wallace voters to have supported Truman. In any case, now you're adding, what is it? Eight plus 47 plus 19, so 55 plus 19. You're adding 74 electoral college votes to the Democratic side. And we already talked about how it's 352 to 189. Now, it's 416 to 115. Which I think it mentions here. If you put that 416 to 115, and they say he would have gotten 54.33% of the popular votes per my calculations. 49.6. Yeah, using my 2.4% approximation, so he would have gone to 54.4, which is pretty accurate. 54.6% to Dewey's 45.1%. He would have won the popular vote in this case by 9.5%, which is crazy. But let's see how this would have affected a tipping point state. But we have to realize that Wallace had support throughout the country. This wasn't like Dewey's Thurman's support, which was concentrated in the South. But looking at some of these other, Wallace states, there weren't too many states where Wallace performed well. This will be a more complicated analysis, seeing as now I actually want to go to the Wikipedia table where I think it will give what it was. Because now there's a bunch of states that we have to consider. Life becomes so much more difficult. Because now you have to find out what the new tipping point state is. And when you can throw all these states together, it becomes very, very tough to do that. It was very, very tough to do that. Looking at this, we're not really even going to factor in the safe states for Democrats. We're just gonna start like in the likely states and go down because obviously safe states will be remaining safe under this. Maybe even going through the likely states in this. We're gonna go start with some of the closest states in the election, and we'll continue going down this hole and seeing where they go, and then organizing them until we get to where Dewey would have gotten to 270 electoral votes. And I know this is complicated, but seeing how much of a landslide this could have been if the Democratic Party wasn't split three ways will probably tell us a bit more as to why 48 they had a congressional elections landslide. So let's start. Arizona is a state that Truman won by 10%. Guess what? Now Truman wins by 11.8%. We'll round down in these cases. Arkansas, solid South, don't really need to worry about it. California, critical swing state where Henry Wallace actually got about 5% of the vote. So California, in this case, you actually have it voting by 5.2% for the Democrats in this case. We're not even going to factor in the Dixiecrat vote because in a lot of these states outside the Deep South, it is minimal. Florida and Georgia, again, solid South. Don't really need to worry about that too much. Colorado, which was actually a close state, with 5.4. 5.4 now plus 6.6 in favor of Democrats. It wouldn't have been enough to tip a lot of these other northeastern states into his column. He won them by like enough. But looking at, some of these other states, many of these states were solid. But like not all of them were. Illinois, he didn't really get a lot of support, so Illinois stays at plus 0.84. But a state like Idaho, where he got 2% of the vote, now he has a 5% margin of victory. And again, you'll see why I'm doing this in a second. And I just realized it's getting very loud because of the washing machine. So you can see it's getting very, very, very loud. Now it's quieted down a bit. So I'll go back. Iowa, you didn't really have, Illinois. Illinois didn't have any of the progressive vote. Iowa had like 1.2% of the progressive vote, I want to say. So, in Iowa, Democrats now have a 3.8% margin of victory. I just wrote it back on this paper by accident. Looking at the state of Massachusetts, that was already pretty comfortable in favor of him. I guess since this could wind up mattering, I will put it down. Massachusetts is now won by Truman by 13.3. Minnesota, this state probably shouldn't even matter at this point because, again, we're trying to get Dewey to 270 and seeing what he needs to do to get there. Nevada, where it does matter, Truman's 3.1% now turns into 5.5% when you add in that vote. New Mexico, I don't think it really makes a difference in any facet. North Carolina, same thing. Ohio, where he gets 1.8% of the vote. Now, Ohio supports Truman by 1.5%. Oklahoma doesn't really matter. Rhode Island doesn't really matter. Tennessee doesn't really matter. And the split there was huge anyway. Utah, state where this could matter, but they get 1%, so Utah is 9%. We'll just round down and say 9.9, because I guess it could matter. Virginia. This state was close. Truman only won it by 6.8. But add in Thurman getting 10.35 in the independent. So you add now like 10.8% of the votes to 6.8. This really puts Virginia out of reach. It's 17.4% for Democrats. Third parties took a safe state like Virginia and they made it close. Finally, Wisconsin and Wyoming. In Wisconsin, now 6.3% for Democrats, and Wyoming, where the progressive really much of an impact, now becomes 5.2%. I have a sheet of paper with me. Remember, Dewey's at 115. He needs to get 270 to win. The closest state is Illinois, where third parties didn't really make any difference. And if you add his votes to the total, Dewey would now be at 143. Illinois is the closest state. Next up, Ohio. Put him at 168. After that, though, there's not a whole lot. The next closest state is Iowa. Put him at 178. Then you get to 5% states. Idaho would only put him at 182. California and Wyoming is basically the same thing. I'll just put Wyoming first because why not? Wyoming puts him at 185. And California puts him at 210. After that, the next state is 5.5% Nevada to put him at 213. Following that, we get even deeper into the Democratic states. Next up is 6.3% Wisconsin, which only puts him at 225 electoral college votes. Colorado is... Wait, I forgot New York. Because New York would have supported him by 7.2. That's an oversight on my part, I will admit. I also forgot Wisconsin and Michigan and Maryland, which would both be like plus 0.5, plus 0.3. I guess it's not too late to add them in. I mean, I know I just spewed out wrong information, but whatever. If we add, I don't think this causes them to win at any point. Seeing they still at 225, if you add these states, these are 27 electoral votes. They put him up to 252 now with that dumb oversight. So this oversight didn't wind up mattering. I mean, I know that a lot of these numbers I put are wrong, but 252 anyway. So he still hasn't won the election yet. Colorado has 6. That's still 258. So it does come down to New York. New York would put Dewey over the 270 mark if he managed to win his home state. But now, as you can see, without third parties, becomes a lot tougher because now he has to win New York and shift the nation over 7.2%. Republicans still have an electoral college bias of 2.3%, but now it's a lot easier to see how the Democrats had coattails. The whole reason why the election was close was because of third parties, and Truman still managed to win in spite of all of that, which is actually very impressive, seeing as when similar occurrences happened in 1968, we saw the Republicans escape with a victory when they probably would have lost had the vote not been split amongst Democrats. It's actually very impressive to see how Democrats, despite the vote being split in 1948, still managed to win the election. And again, a considerable amount of the Electoral College bias goes away. It's still 2.3%. That's actually what it was in line for 1944, when the tipping point state was New York, but it was 5%. And in the popular vote in that election, we saw Roosevelt win the popular vote by 7.5%. So now it's not as hard for me to see as to why there was a coattail effect so significant in 1948. The main reason it came down to is that Democrats were popular. They just didn't all vote for Truman. And as a result, now you're sort of put into this thing where it's like, what could have happened if they hadn't split? Because the year was a big enough Democratic wave that despite a huge split in the party, you still managed to see them come out on top. And now this election actually turns out to be stronger than 1944, even though there were fewer electoral college votes. You know. And this should make sense. We're not going to look at the Senate, because the Senate, as we know, depends on map. But look at the House. In 1944, Democrats gained 22 seats, 20 were to the expense of Republicans, to turn their very narrow 222 to 209 majority into a 244 to 189 majority, also winning the House popular vote by 4.7%. In 46, Republicans win the House popular vote by 8.5%. They flip 55 seats to gain a 246 to 188 majority. They gain 55 seats. In 48, though, Democrats gain a whopping 75 seats. It's now a 263 to 171 edge in favor of the Democratic Party, and they win the House popular vote by 7.2%. Well, the reason as to why, it was so big was because a lot of these people were supporting Democrats. They just, they just weren't supporting them at the presidential election level. Like, the Solid South still was all Democrats, except for that one district in eastern Tennessee that flipped towards the Republican Party. It was still significantly Democratic, and that's the big reason why we saw this happen. That is why 1948 had the coattail effect. The election could have been a landslide for Democrats, even bigger than, 1944, probably on par with 1940. It was only close because the Democratic Party was split.